Like I said, Go Nitro, Rise of the Blades is a superhero story, and hopefully you guys will enjoy this chapter enough to want to continue reading. And this is not something that I do very often. So, this is Go Nitro, The Rise of the Blades. Chapter 1, A Project. A lone man stood in a small metal room with his hands folded behind his back. He stared through a sheet of glass into the next chamber with his eyes locked on what was within. This was a man en route to become the most famous and infamous scientist in history. He was a man with a million possible sins plaguing his mind. A man who's lost in an endless maze of thoughts. Every now and then, someone would walk by the door behind him, and he would perk up a bit in anticipation, before they would pass, allowing him to relax again. One of the most important meetings in existence was about to take place, and on the other side of the glass was the subject. His creation, a science project. Not his first, but by far his most important. Dr. Philip Redmond was in his mid-60s, with stripes of gray coating the sides of his otherwise brown hair. His face pushed inwards under his defined cheekbones. 2 long wrinkles ran across his forehead, and round glasses balanced delicately on the end of his nose. A long white lab coat hid most of his body. The crisp new fabric was, as of yet, unblemished. His old coats were tucked away, hiding the stains and scars of past experiments. Some called Redmond old, but most referred to him as experienced. Redmond was known for his inventions designed for the betterment of mankind, though no invention, no creation, had ever been as drastic as this one. A few more moments passed, then the door to the room slowly eased open, and a man stepped inside. "Professor?" The word hung in the air, motionless, waiting for a response. Redmond turned his head, meeting the eyes of a tall, dark man with sleek hair and a thick jaw. He was wearing a jet black suit without a single wrinkle. Redmond could see an earpiece that fed all information to who knows where. Redmond nodded in acknowledgement. "Good afternoon," he said as pleasantly as possible. Reaching into his jacket, the man pulled out his credentials, flipped them open for a moment, and then quickly tucked them away again. "Agent Blake Sterling," he said shortly. He walked forward, approaching the table in the center of the room. He grabbed a chair and prepared to take a seat, but not before motioning towards the chair opposite him. Redmond held his position near the glass for a moment, and then made his way to the table. "Professor Redmond, I don't want there to be any insinuation that I don't admire and appreciate the work you've done, but this meeting is necessary. The well-being of our entire nation could be at risk because of you." "I assure you that isn't the case, Agent Sterling," Redmond asserted as he took his seat. "And how do you justify that claim?" Sterling folded his arms for a moment before motioning towards the scientist. "You approached the Bureau 2 years ago with nothing but formulas and ideas. You were told that the project would be considered, and yet here you are, sitting in front of the thing you were never given permission to create." Redmond remained silent for a moment, choosing his words. Before he could, Sterling lifted an arm and pointed toward the glass behind Redmond. And if I remember your original proposal correctly, that creation sitting in there is not the only one planned." Redmond sighed and nodded. "Yes, it's true," he began. "I was never given full approval on Project Nitro, but you must understand the time sensitivity of this. I won't pretend what I did was within the boundaries of the law, but you can't pretend that this nation doesn't need it." Sterling shook his head and closed his eyes. "Redmond, 400 innocent people lost their lives in a single attack 4 years ago," Redmond cut in. "Since then, the attacks and threats from this gang have been relentless, and law enforcement is completely incapable of stopping them. Hell, even the FBI hasn't managed to. The Blades will be dealt with, Professor, without the use of your weapons of mass destruction. They are not weapons of mass destruction. They are human beings." There was another silence. A long, tense silence resounded in the antechamber. Redmond turned his head and looked back through the glass. Sitting on the other side was a young boy at a lone table with his hands open in front of him. 18 years old. His hair was a disheveled mess of brown, and his skin was rough with unkempt facial hair. He was staring down at his palms with a level of concentration that most boys his age would find impossible. But this boy was anything but ordinary. "He's not a human being," Sterling added. "Not anymore. We know very well what Project Nitro was designed to do and what it turned that boy into. With that in mind, let's address the other elephant in the room. Where, might I ask, did you acquire these human test subjects?" Redmond fell silent for a moment. He knew what he had done was illegal, immoral even, but necessary. Redmond shook his head a little, resting his hands on the table. "They were orphans," he quietly replied. "Orphans?" Sterling asked accusingly. Redmond nodded. "Their families were all tragically lost near the beginning of the project." "So you just assumed they wouldn't be missed?" Sterling challenged. "There were never any assumptions, Agent. Each one of the Nitros was selected for a very specific reason, and they knew exactly what they were signing up for." Sterling leaned back in his chair, held a hand against his temple, and closed his eyes briefly. "You're putting me in a really bad position here, Professor," he said, opening his eyes again. "So arrest me!" Redmond yelled as he snapped his head up. Sterling pulled his hand away at the outburst, surprised at the sudden emotion from Redmond. Redmond pushed himself up so he was leaning across the table. 400 people, Sterling. The entire Faraday Center went up in flames and took 400 innocent people with it. Why do you keep bringing that up, Redmond? Sterling stood up as well to meet Redmond's eyes. "It was a tragedy, yes, but you keep referring to it like some kind of justification for your actions. Is there something I should know here?" Redmond sighed as he slowly sat back down. He looked back and forth between Sterling and a random point off in the distance, like it was his one chance at avoiding what needed to be said. "What do you know about the attack?" He finally spoke in almost a whisper. Sterling shrugged and cautiously returned to his seat, folding his hands on the table while he did. "We know a high-ranking member of the Blades broke into the Faraday Research Center back in 2064. Scott Sells. Guy was an expert thief, which is why they sent him in to Guy was an expert thief, which is why they sent him to break in and get some sort of chemical. We still don't know what it was or why the Blades were after it. There was a scuffle with security, and as far as we know, a rogue bullet ignited something in the center that triggered the explosion. An evacuation of the building was started, but a quarter of the people inside never made it to the doors." Redmond nodded and pulled some papers detailing Project Nitro down in front of him. "It wasn't just some chemical Scott was going after," Redmond corrected. "The substance is called petroleum. It's a unique element my former colleague, Professor Miles Silva, and I created to serve as an alternate fuel source." Sterling reached across the table and pulled the papers forward, examining the data printed on them. "Why have we never heard of this?" "Never made it to your level, unfortunately. The element gave off such a high amount of unidentified radiation that I had the project shut down, which Silva really didn't approve of." "Not surprising. Sounds like you could have made billions." "Yes, but I wasn't prepared to find out the cost. It needed more research before becoming available to the public, and Silva was completely against that. The petroleum is sealed inside of airtight tubes because of its reactive nature. Any contact with the air causes it to catastrophically break down and ignite. The rogue bullet in the Faraday Center struck the tanks of petroleum that Scott Sells was there to steal. That's what triggered the meltdown." Sterling nodded and tapped the table a bit. "And that's not the last of it. When I shut down the project, Silva took the remaining petroleum and stored it in labs and warehouses all over Lattice Light City. The Blades came to power after they discovered what he had done and started to track it down faster than we could." "So you blame yourself? For the lab? For the Blades?" Redmond didn't respond, but his silence was enough of an answer. Sterling continued strumming his fingers on the table, but leaned slightly to the side so he could look into the next room. "You really think these kids can stop them?" Redmond turned again so he could look at the boy as well. Yes, I do. "Their abilities." I see a typo. I'll fix that later. Make them extremely dangerous. You know that, don't you, Phil? How am I supposed to give my superiors a guarantee that these nitros of yours will support our cause? Redmond looked back at Sterling and then down at his files. He slowly flipped open his folder, showing a page detailing Nicholas J. Bruno. Sterling looked at the attached photo, connecting the name to the face he saw in the next room. Nick's father was a security guard on duty that night, Redmond explained. He's the one who discovered Scott and sounded the alarm. Without him and the evacuation he started, hundreds more could have been killed when the lab went up. Sterling put his hands out to the sides like he was expecting more. Sounds like a guy doing his job, he replied. However well he did it. I'm still not convinced here, Professor. A week later, the Blades discovered what he did. Sterling put down his hands, predicting where the story would go. Hours later, Nick Bruno had his mother, father, and brother taken away from him. Sterling looked back at Nick, who was now standing and slowly pacing back and forth. The other 4 subjects have just as much reason to hate the Blades. Sterling closed his eyes and sighed. So you were telling me you want to send 5 dangerous biohumans into the public seeking revenge and vengeance? No, Redmond quickly replied. I want to give 5 helpless individuals the chance to make things right. Sterling put a hand on his temple again and slowly shook his head. I think they deserve that much, Blake. Sterling stopped shaking his head and dropped his hand back to the table. You're risking a lot here, Redmond. Not just for you and me, but for innocent people out there, he said, pointing towards the door. I know you have a conscience. I know you don't want more blood on your hands, so I'm leaving this decision to you. Do you really trust them? Redmond took one final look over his shoulder at Nick. He looked at Nick's dark brown eyes, staring down at his own hands. As Redmond watched, he couldn't fight the smile that came across his face. Yes, Agent. I trust the Nitros with my life. Sterling hit his hands on the table and stood up from his chair. Very well, Professor. I'll let the Bureau know Project Nitro has temporary approval under my judgment, for which I'm sure I'll get a stern talking to. Redmond also stood up and reached out his hand. Sterling accepted the handshake. Thank you, Blake. Sterling nodded and turned to the door. He opened it and began to walk out, but before completely leaving, he turned his head back. Redmond. Redmond looked up at the door. Don't make me regret this. Sterling walked out of the room and let the door close tight behind him. Redmond took a moment. Feelings of relief and hope washed over him. It was another item checked off his list, and now another had taken its place. Redmond turned his head to look back at Nick. The two needed to have a chat, but how could Redmond handle this delicate situation? Nick had left the table and was now... Oh, I already said that. Let me delete that. Every now and again, Nick would look down at his hands, tense them up a bit, and then shake his head, dismissing rogue thoughts. I'm just gonna type something. Nicholas, Redmond's voice called out. Nick started to turn, sighing while he did. Listen, Professor, we haven't had a chance to really talk yet, and Nick opened his eyes and threw his arm up into the air, catching a clipboard only inches from his forehead. Several pages flew off after the sudden stop and fluttered into Nick's face before lightly falling to the ground. As the dropping pages cleared from in front of him, Redmond came into view. He was standing in the doorway, his arms still out from throwing the clipboard at his target. He smirked, reached down, and straightened his jacket. Nice reflexes, he complimented, smoothing a wrinkle from his sleeve. What the hell was that? Redmond turned to a small bin next to the doorway and pulled another clipboard out. Nick threw out his arms in exasperation. Great. You've got another one. Are you planning to throw that one as well? Nick couldn't be sure. Oh, I see. Sorry. Nick couldn't be sure because he thought he saw the slightest gleam of amusement in Redmond's eyes. Increased reaction speed and reflexes. Check, Redmond chimed off. Increased strength? He asked, glancing up. Nick waited a beat before pointing at his own chest. Are you talking about me right now? Am I? Redmond lifted his pen and pointed towards the clipboard Nick was holding. Nick sighed, grabbed the clipboard with two hands before effortlessly snapping it in half. Yeah, Redmond, it's a clipboard. Doesn't take much that snapping a steel clipboard with little to no effort. Or snapping steel with little to no effort, Redmond noted, without even acknowledging Nick. Increased strength? Check. Nick slowly looked down at the two halves of the clipboard, seeing the tear was made across bent and shredded metal. He shook his head a couple of times, dropping the pieces to the ground. He started to chuckle a little bit. You're kidding me, right? Redmond made another mark on his paper before turning to a switch next to the door. No, he replied. People tell me I don't have a great sense of humor. You threw a clipboard at my head. Redmond flipped the switch and the wall behind Nick began to hum. He turned around and saw the wall split down the middle and begin to retract, revealing another small room hidden behind it. This one was filled with small targets. Some were moving while others were stationary and holding guns pointed in Nick's direction. Nick glanced back and forth at a few of the targets before smirking. He turned to Redmond, pointing a thumb over his shoulder at the mannequins. You're serious, he asked. A firing range. Redmond nodded a little while shrugging and stepping forward. Basically. Nick stopped and stared at the professor. You could use practice. He turned around to examine the targets one more time before looking down at his hands. You're not talking about... It wasn't a dream, Nicholas, Redmond interrupted while getting closer. Nick couldn't help but take a step back as Redmond approached. Redmond was an enigma to Nick. He knew things Nick had never even thought about and was always at least 2 steps ahead. Nick's only dilemma was deciding whether or not that was a good thing. I know your memory isn't in perfect condition, but the procedure must be in there somewhere, Redmond said gently. Of course it is, Nick snapped back. Redmond paused, seeing the stress building in Nick's face. It was as if every memory for Nick seemed harmless on the surface, but pulling it only revealed a tangled web of gnarled roots underneath. He only ever saw flashes of his past, fragmented images and broken recollections. Nick closed his eyes and shook his head. When his eyes opened again, he was lying on a metal table, with both his arms strapped down tightly by his sides. Is this really necessary? He asked Redmond. Redmond patted Nick on the shoulder and looked off into the darkness. Trust me, it's for your own safety, as well as everyone else in here. You strapped me down, Nick stated, turning back to Redmond. Put this giant thing over my arm. Nick was back on the table, with a large machine sliding across a track on the ceiling until it was perfectly positioned over the center of Nick's arm. As the machine started winding up and buzzing to life, a large needle slid down and lined itself up. Nick could see a red liquid within the device, bubbling and changing like it was magma. Redmond? Nick yelled. Redmond, wait, I don't know about... The needle fired down into Nick's arm, and everything went red. Nick glanced down at his arm, watching his veins glow a faint red underneath his skin, like they were on fire. He slowly clenched his hand into a fist and closed his eyes. I'm sorry, Nick, Redmond began. I couldn't anticipate the pain of the procedure, but I could anticipate the results. Nick opened his eyes again to look up at the professor. I told you I wanted to help you make things right, and that's exactly what I've done. Giving you the ability and the opportunity to do that. Now I can't make you do anything. And I don't want to. Then what do you want, Redmond? Redmond relaxed his stance and looked back towards the targets. I want you to do what's right. Nick fell silent, staring at the professor, who seemed to be refusing to look back. Nick turned slightly and examined the targets downrange. He closed his hand into a fist, causing his veins to begin glowing again. Okay, Redmond, Nick quietly agreed. Redmond looked back at Nick, turning to square up on the range. Just do me one favor? Redmond raised an eyebrow as Nick peeked back over his shoulder, meeting eyes with the professor. Just stand back. Nick closed his other hand into a fist as well, right before his entire body began tensing up. He slowly turned his head back while taking in a deep breath. Once his long inhale ended, he lifted up his hands while slowly spreading out his fingers. He pointed them in the general area of the targets and then began to exhale. As he did, he felt a warm sensation travel from his spine and slither its way through his veins. It snaked past his shoulders, through his arms, and collected in his hands. The pressure that built up in his palms made it feel like 2 heavy weights were suddenly crushing down on his knuckles. His exhale gained a voice, and he couldn't keep in a faint yell as the pressure released and fire began to leak out from under his nails. The fire crawled around his fingers before gathering in his palm. With one final push, he forced his hands forward, causing the fire to leap from his palms and explode outwards into a fiery cone. The light from the fire reflected off the metallic walls, bathing the room in a blinding red light. As Nick turned slowly, the fire followed, torching every target and setting them ablaze. Redmond stepped back, covering his face with his clipboard to guard against the intense light and heat. Nick started to close his fingers into the fire, collapsing it into a thinner, even more intense inferno. He began to pull his hands back towards the chest before finally throwing his arms out to the sides, making the fire evaporate into a few lasting flames and sparks. Small wisps of fire danced in the air around Nick as embers fell to the floor and faded to black. Redmond slowly lowered his clipboards at the sight of Nick standing with his hands by his sides, breathing heavily. Sweat was dripping down Nick's face and evaporating into steam before getting a chance to drop to the floor. In front of him were the charred remains of the targets. The fire he created had been so intense that the metal weaponry they held was glowing a faint orange. "Nick," Redmond began. He paused for a moment before realizing there were hardly any words to really say. Nick tried to regain his composure, slowing his breathing and wiping some sweat from his forehead. "That," he started between heaves of oxygen, "was pretty damn awesome." And that, my friends, is the end of Chapter 1 of Go Nitro, Return of the Blades. So, yeah, that's the first chapter where you are introduced to Dr. Philip Redmond, the man behind Project Nitro, and Nicholas Bruno, soon to be known as Nuclear, who is the main, he's one of the main heroes, one of the Nitros. Maybe if I get this thing written, I'll read more of it on stream, hopefully. I might even just read the whole thing on stream one day. All right, everybody, have a good one. See you next time.